Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, I'm going to show you how I set up a development environment, specifically an Ubuntu Jammy virtual machine. I do all of my work in a virtual machine because I have a bunch of reasons, but I will link my further discussion of that in the description. I've also done a video about this for the previous release of Ubuntu, but I figured I would update it since it's now 2 years old and show you how I set up a virtual machine and all the steps that I go through that. We're going to skip ahead at some points, so there will be cuts in the middle, but bear with me. All right, let's jump into it. Okay, we have a special scene today that's zoomed in because the program doesn't have zoom. Anyway, the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to download the ISO for the disk image, I guess. So you can do that by searching Ubuntu 22.04 download, 22 being the LTS release. I usually only use LTS releases personally because I like the stability. You may want to deviate from that if you like unstable stuff more, but I prefer stability, so I use the stable release. We're going to be using the desktop image. This gives you a graphical UI that you can click around in, and so we'll go to here. This is actually going to start downloading it for us. I'm going to cancel that because I have already downloaded it ahead of time. So make sure that you have this ISO ready. That's the first step that we're going to need. I'm going to be using VirtualBox to set up my virtual machine. I'm going to show you all the settings that I use to make it performant as well. Because without these, it doesn't perform the best. And you can see I've already set one up beforehand. This one I did on stream to make sure that everything works well. And normally I'm running this, and that's what I do my video content in. So we are going to start by making a brand new virtual machine. And the name of this is actually important. Well, it isn't super important, but VirtualBox will auto-detect what you're using if you name it properly. So if we say Ubuntu 22.04, we'll give it _2 since I already made one already. We're actually not going to touch any of these settings yet, and we will touch those later on before we boot it for the first time. So we are going to adjust the memory. We're not going to leave it at the default 1 GB. That's going to be way too small for what we're dealing with. We are going to create a virtual hard disk. So we will click create. Oh, actually, you will probably see it in this mode. Let's do it in this mode. It doesn't really matter. We're going to be customizing the settings anyway. So you have to rename it here. It will detect that you're Linux and Ubuntu. I have a special location that I put my virtual machines inside of this. You can put them wherever you want. It doesn't really matter. The default location is probably fine for you unless you have external disks like I do. Then we're going to click through this guided setup. So we're going to do next. We are going to skip this step. Just leave it at the default. We'll change it in a second. So next, create a virtual hard disk. We are going to do create. I usually leave the default VDI. This is the VirtualBox image. If you're using this with other virtual machine providers, you may pick a different one, but you probably won't be. This is the first thing that's going to make a big difference in performance. The default is dynamically allocated, which can be helpful if you want to resize your VM at some point, but it comes with a pretty significant performance cost. I always use fixed size now, now that I realized how much faster it is. It is going to take a little bit of extra time while we're setting up this virtual machine, but it'll pay off in the long run. So I'm going to select fixed size. We're going to do next. This default of 10 GB is way too small. I would recommend at least 40, although my most recent virtual machine, I did 100. But for the sake of the video, let's do 40. 40 is a decent size, and you can make this smaller. The minimum it recommends is 10. 10 is going to be a little bit crunched for space, so I would recommend at least 40 when you're dealing with this. And this is one of the parts that's going to take a while. So we'll click create, and it is going to set up that virtual machine disk image for us. It basically is doing a disk format on those 40 GB for us. And since it's pre-allocating it up front, it won't have to do, disk resizing and a bunch of IO later on. And so this will save you a bunch of time. But as you see here, this is going to take a little while. So I'm going to cut here, and I'll see you when it is done. All right, so it has completed setting up that virtual disk, and now we're almost ready for our first boot. But before we boot for the first time, we're going to set up a few settings. I'm going to do that by clicking through to the settings portion of this, and we're going to be setting the memory, processor count, etc. We'll click on the system tab. That is the first one that I recommend doing, and we're going to set the memory. Now, your computer probably won't have 64 gigs of RAM like I do, but you'll want to set the RAM appropriately. So what I usually recommend is at least a quarter of your RAM. So on like a 16 gig machine, I would recommend setting at 4 gigabytes, which would be 4096. If you're on an 8 gig machine, I would recommend not going as low as 2. Like I would probably do 3, which is going to be right in the middle here. It's not quite 3. Maybe it doesn't let you do 3. But even, you know, 2 gigabytes is probably the bare minimum that I would suggest. 4 gigabytes is usually good enough. On my machine, I do 8 because I have a bit more RAM, but you know, going above 8 is probably not going to help you too much. So I would recommend 4. For processor count, I recommend doing slightly under half of the CPUs that you have. So mine has 6 physical cores and 12 virtual cores. So I usually set this at 5. If you're on a 4 processor machine, I would recommend 2. If you're on 4 virtual cores, 2 physical cores, I would recommend 2. And that's kind of the bare minimum. Actually, on my laptop, I set it at 1 CPU, and that works all right, but sometimes you want some multiprocessing. So I recommend setting this to be above 1. The other thing we're going to do, and this might vary based on your processor, is we're going to check both of these boxes. This enables some virtualization features that if your processor supports it, it'll have those. It's not super important if your processor doesn't support those. So don't worry about those if these are grayed out on your computer. Next, we're going to check acceleration. This should already be checked for you. You shouldn't have to change anything here. The last thing that we're going to change in sort of settings stuff is in our display. We're going to give it as much display memory as possible. So it starts with 33, which is a little bit small. I usually bump this all the way up to 128, and I check the enable 3D acceleration option. Now, some processors and some machines, this will actually make it perform worse. So check this toggle and see if it makes it better or worse based on checking it or not. On my machine, it makes it much, much faster, but sometimes it doesn't. The last thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up a shared folder, and this is optional. You don't have to do this, but I find this to be really useful when copying things in and out of the virtual machine. So I'm going to click plus here. It's going to prompt us to set up a folder here, and I usually like to put it directly next to my virtual machine. So you can see this is where my virtual machine got created. I usually like to make a shared folder that has the same name as my virtual machine, but underscore shared. And we do select, oh, we actually have to do new folder here. Right. So if we do Ubuntu 2204 underscore 2 underscore shared, and then we select that folder. Nope, don't rename it. Select it. Then that will allow this. I also check the auto mount option. It doesn't always make a difference, but I usually like to select it, and we'll click OK. All right, that is all we are going to do before we boot for the first time. Now we're ready to boot, so we're going to click Start. This will prompt us to select our disk image. We haven't selected one yet, but it will tell us to do that. Oh, that's off screen. Well, this is what it's prompting me for, select the disk image. Yours probably won't be pre-selected, but I have just created this, so we're going to basically click this icon and select through your disk image. I've already set up my 2204 one, so I'm going to choose that one, and I'm going to click Start. And we're going to start our initial boot. Oh, try to move this over here. There we go. Now you can watch the initial boot. And we're going to select this try or install Ubuntu. This is all going to be done through the keyboard. And sometimes this is poorly sized. We'll actually fix that later in the tutorial. So unfortunately, it's going to be this little itty bitty tiny screen for most of the setup. So we will do install Ubuntu, and this will start the installer. And it's going to take a little bit to get booted up, but I'll show you all the options that I set while setting this up. The installer is actually fairly quick, but we will pause at one point for the software install parts. There's our jammy jellyfish. Okay, I'm going to start by turning the volume off. And we're going to click install Ubuntu. It's going to have us pick our keyboard. There is one kind of annoying thing about the default screen size, and I think this is actually a bug in the installer. But yeah, these buttons are cut off at the bottom. Nothing I can do about that, but fortunately we can kind of see what they are anyway. I like to select a minimal installation. This prevents a whole bunch of different software and packages from being installed. You can always install those later. I like to check the download updates, and I check this box. It actually doesn't matter for us since we're in a virtual machine. We don't need any special drivers, but I check the box anyway. At least it makes it consistent when I install it on an actual machine. Then we're going to do continue, and now it's going to install all of the software for us. May actually skip us to user creation next. Oh, no, we have to click install one more time. And continue. Oh, now it's going to prompt us for time zones. Yeah, New York is close enough to my current time zone. If you're in California, you would do this, but I am in Eastern time, so we're going to click continue. Oh, now my clock time is correct. Cool. Now it's going to ask you to set up your username. I use the same username as my GitHub handle. You can name your computer whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. And you'll set up a password here. I don't click this login automatically. There's some like weird bugs in Keyring that well, maybe it's fixed now, but I prefer to log in my password. But I also don't use a particularly strong password for my virtual machine just because I show it on stream. So I'm going to type bad password as my password. Bad password. And continue. And you can see it's basically, it's almost done setting up already. All right, so the software has finished installing, and we're going to do our first reboot. We're going to have to do a couple of these to get to the end. We'll click restart now. Now, it'll still boot into the really small size here. Oh, actually, we have to press enter to get it to continue. Now, it's still going to boot into that really small screen size, so I'm going to show you how to fix that next. It's going to take a couple of steps, and we're going to have to install the guest editions for VirtualBox. This is kind of the special drivers that allow the underlying machine to be resized and have clipboard work and have shared folders work and all that other stuff. So I'll type my bad password in there, boot into this again. Still going to be tiny. I skip all these. I don't send system info personally. I don't enable location services. I don't really set up any of those. But yeah, we're jumping ahead. So Control-Alt-T, that'll open up a terminal. You can also press the Command key or Windows key or whatever it is on your computer keyboard. We are going to install a few packages. This is going to allow us to build the guest edition. So we're going to do sudo apt update and type in bad password. And then we are going to do sudo apt install, and we're going to install GCC, make, and Perl. We need those three packages in order to set up guest editions. Sudo apt install GCC, make, and Perl. And it's going to prompt us for this. We are going to say yes. And we let it download and install those updates for us. Basically, it's installing a C compiler so we can build some kernel extensions. And it's going to take about 5 seconds. Once that is done, we will be inserting the guest edition CD, which it's not, well, you don't actually need a physical CD. It's going to show up as a virtual CD. So we can close out of this. We're going to click the devices menu, and we're going to do insert guest editions CD image. Should pop up with a little CD icon over here. It didn't always do that for me. So it's supposed to auto run, but for some reason it seems like it's not auto running anymore. So you can just double click on, oh, can't double click on that. All right, we'll run it from the terminal then. CD to media and your username, and then whatever VirtualBox guest editions is, and we're going to do /autorun.sh. I don't know why it doesn't auto run anymore, but such is life, I guess. Bad password. Oops, bad password. Apparently can't even type bad password. Okay, this will set up guest editions, and then after this is done, we'll have to reboot our machine one final time, and then we'll have all of the features enabled. And I'll show you kind of the shared folder stuff, as well as the other options that I set up in my VM, and we'll be able to finally resize it from not being 640 by 480. All right, now it's done. We're going to click enter, and we are going to close out of the terminal, and we're going to restart our computer. Well, restart our virtual machine. And now when it boots up, hopefully it will dynamically size the windows so that we don't have to do any of the we don't have to change the monitor screen size and all that other stuff. That should do it automatically now. After we log in. Bad password. And now, in theory, I should be able to make it bigger. Ta-da! Okay, cool. So, actually, log in so that we can still see it here. Now, this is the last set of things that I do to set things up. I usually like to set shared clipboard to bidirectional. This allows me to, copy and paste from, say, my notes here. I can copy here and then paste it into a terminal. It allows you to use a bidirectional clipboard. I don't really do anything else here. The other thing I want to show you is the shared folder and where that'll show up. It'll be in media SF and then whatever the name of your shared folder is. By default, you won't be able to view it because it is owned by another user, the VBox SF user. But if you add yourself to this group, you'll be able to view that. Or if you use, sudo to look inside of it, you'll be able to see what's in that shared folder. I usually add my user to this group. That way I can read and write from this directory without having to do anything special. Oh, yeah, and that's the other thing. When you do a fresh install, it'll also tell you to update a bunch of packages. So you'll probably want to do these as well, especially when there's security updates. But anyway, that's kind of the basics of how I get started with a virtual machine. And from there, you can install whatever software you want, install your text editors, your interpreters, etc. I use a configuration management system just to configure my machine. I'll link a video about how I do that as well. But anyway, hopefully you found this useful. If there are additional things you would like me to explain, leave a comment below or reach out to me on the various platforms. But thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one.